So hello, everybody. Here we are again. For those that are tuning in, I'm Jacqui. We met last week, my father, Michael. And last week in this sort of introductory summary experience to the classic text, the Bhagavad Gita, we aimed to do our very best for an introductory overview. We did have a giggle at the end of it, realizing that we possibly had planned far too much content than we could fit into that initial session. And I think it's difficult with a text that holds so much richness. Of course, in this overview series, we're bound to miss bits here and there, but we're going to endeavour to do our very best week upon week to really capture the true essence of this text and how it can help us as human beings in life. So welcome, Michael. And today we're looking at chapter 1 of the Bhagavad Gita. We're going to break it down into two halves so that we can adequately cover the chapter. Michael, I might just let you say hello to everyone and explain or give some context as to why we're breaking it in half and how important chapter 1 is.
Well, thank you, Jacqui, and hello to you and hello to all the listeners. Yes, well, simply all the chapters really we're going to have to break into at least two podcasts, Jacqui, because there's so much context in it, and because we discussed doing a 40 podcasts. So, but this chapter in particular, chapter 1, is very important, as was the introduction last week, introducing the sort of background to the Gita. Chapter 1 is like when we watch films or read books, that early sort of part of that is very, very important, because it sort of sets a bit of a scene that the whole rest of the film or the book is sort of based on. So it's important we understand this or spend some time and some detail on understanding the chapter, because it covers the sort of the foundation, if you like, for the rest of the book.
Beautiful. And last week we did attempt to bring up some diagrams which would have been useful for you to speak to. We're going to start with one of those today. Let me share the screen now and bring it up. It's a diagram entitled "Who Am I?" and it just gives some more context as to the human condition. So I'm hoping you can see that now, Michael, and perhaps you could speak us through this diagram and how it's useful to us.
Yes, well, I did mention it last week, so I won't spend any time on it now. But I've suggested to Jacqui that this would be a diagram that would be useful to throw up on future podcasts, particularly in that subtle aspect that's in the middle there, because that's where most of the teaching sort of centres on. And for us as the human beings that are involved in trying to learn and make some changes maybe in our lives. So just to quick revision while it's up there, we're broken up into what's called, in most people who work in this area and write books or have discussions, one way or another, it's referring to this sort of diagram. This is just one I put together that made sense to me, and the people I've worked with in groups over the years have found it very helpful to understand visually, just in that diagram, different topics we're covering. So simply down the bottom, you've got a picture of a human being called the physical body. There's 5 senses there that you can see. I've mentioned about 3-story building. So they're like the stairway or the gateway into that second part of our being, the subtle, which is called the subtle part. And then that has 4 components: the emotions, the mind, the ego, and the buddhi. Most people understand mind and emotions very easily. They understand 5 senses easily, and they understand the body easily. The ego is a bit dodgy, and buddhi is almost unknown in most people. Then there's the soul. And I mentioned that above the 3-story building, so that's the 3 stories, there was another section called consciousness or God or the absolute, or whatever term you like to call it. So I won't elaborate on that any further. Just Jacqui was able to bring it up today, and I thought it'd be useful just to show it. The next diagram. Go on, Jacqui.
Mm-hmm. So I should just mention to everyone, this one, as you can probably tell, is an AI artistic rendition, but we just tried to put something together that will adequately be a backdrop to what Michael's about to explain.
Yes, well, the actual temple's not AI, it's only the inscription on the top, know thyself, but that's the critical point I want to describe in this diagram, and again, seeing it. So we're looking at Krishna's teachings of about 5,000 years ago, and then we're looking at some of the Greek teachings here at about 2,500 years ago. So 5,000 years between Krishna and another 2,500 years after him, his message in one way or another was still being referred to in humanity's development. And so in this temple at Delphi in ancient Greece resided what was called an oracle in those days. Today we'd call that person a guru or a sage or a wise man. And people went there for advice, rulers and emperors and all sorts of things. So that's symbolic of what we're doing in these sorts of podcasts as well. But the important words that are there, or the most important aspect of that diagram, are the two words, know thyself. Now, that's really critical, because that diagram that Jacqui just had up before is know thyself as a human being. And I've always stressed to all the students I've taken in the groups, and I'll stress this from my own experience as well, that we know one part of ourselves. And when we get to know the other part of ourselves, because there's two parts, and we're going to have a diagram on that in the coming podcasts, where it'll be talking about two selves. This is what know thyself means. So most people are familiar with one know thyself, and that's that physical, mental, emotional, egoic sort of being, but they don't know very much about know thyself in that other aspect of a divine or higher type of being. I'd just also like to, at this point, quote from Socrates and Plato, who were part of this sort of era. Now, Socrates says, and referring to that diagram, he says, could a man or a woman who is knowledgeable about many things be considered wise if they didn't know themselves? And Plato, his student, who wrote most of his teachings, he says, I must first know myself, as the Delphinian inscription says. To be curious of that which is not my concern, while I am in ignorance of my own self, would be ridiculous. So you can see there's Socrates and Plato that most of you would be familiar with to some extent or other, and they're referring to this same aspect. And so this topic of the, so I'll just finish on there, and then Jacqui can remove the diagram. So throughout these podcasts, as we explore the exotic teachings of the Gita, we have a wonderful opportunity to transcend our false or illusory understanding of know thyself to a true and a real understanding of know thyself. And that's the work that we'll be covering over the 18 chapters of the Gita. Thanks, Jacqui. You can, thank you.
Lovely.
So I just thought that'd be useful, Jacqui, for people to understand via that diagram that what it is that we'll be doing in these remaining podcasts is focusing on knowing thyself. And the reason that that's very important, or one of the reasons that's very important, firstly, it's the most important, is for us, each individual, to know themselves. But along the way, once you start to know yourself more and more clearly, and you can be doing that right from these podcasts now, don't have to wait until the 40th podcast, is that the more you know yourself, the more you know every other person on the planet. So you'll get to know better why your husband or wife or your children or your parents or your best friends or your brothers and sisters or politicians or the media or anyone on the planet, why they're saying things, how they're saying things, what the motives are behind them, what's driving them emotionally or intellectually or whatever. You'll also start to recognize that if there's an absence of your divine self or your divine spark, the higher self, well, then nothing much is ever going to eventuate of any substance in your lives. And so there'll be a turning within you and a desire within you to understand more of this other part of myself that I haven't been maybe at all familiar or only starting to be familiar with. And the hunger and the desire to understand that higher aspect of ourselves will keep growing in a person and eventually drive them to what's called self-realization.
It's such an important point. And even as you were speaking, and sorry, this is a bit unscripted, but it just reminded me once of a conversation I had with a mental health counselor in a workplace at one point. And she was an incredibly intelligent woman, and she knew her personality and her tendencies and all of the more physical and mental and emotional components of herself. She knew them exceptionally well, better than most people. But I remember her once referring to that statement of know thyself. And she had a sense of she's very satisfied with her level of knowing oneself. But it occurred to me as she was sharing that what she really knew was not, in fact, the entire picture of what was possible, that there hadn't been some spiritual awakening or interest in the higher self. So her capacity to know oneself was really in that base level. And I think that's really important for people that, of course, people listening will be coming from all backgrounds and have a whole range of experiences. Some may be well developed along the spiritual path and have a sense of their inner and true self. And some people are just exploring and beginning to emerge into that space, and perhaps it feels a little confusing. But I think it's important to realize that we all know ourselves to one level, and wherever we're at on that spectrum, we're generally still learning and evolving and coming to learn this part that we're not often taught in childhood. We're not taught as adolescence and young adulthood. And as you say, it often takes something to happen in life in a significant way to tune us into that line of inquiry where we're interested to start learning more deeply. Who are we at the very essence of our being?
Well, yes, so it's a perfect example, Jacqui, of what I was saying, and I'm glad you've brought that in, because it gives me sort of just another opportunity to elaborate a little bit more on what I was saying. So the two selves that we're going to explore, basically every person on the planet knows one part of their self very easily, as Jacqui just described with this lady. So you know your mind, you know your profession, or what you're good at, what you're bad at, all of those sorts of things. But it's the other part, the divine part, the spiritual part of the being that's lacking in most people. And so the focus in this teaching over the 18 chapters is how to transcend what's called the mortal aspect of our being to the immortal aspect of our being. And the biggest paradox of all of the teachings on the planet to any human being is that we have to start off with the small mortal self, with all its limitations and problems and issues and so on. And it's eventually a build-up of those problems that'll drive the person to seek some answers that are unknown to them. And so the paradox is that we have to use that diagram that you showed at the start, the body, the subtle aspect of the being, and your soul, the higher aspect in you via the buddhi, to connect with that ultimate source. And so we're using a limited mortal being to transcend its limitations and turn into an immortal being. If that makes any sense, Jacqui, or I'm sure it does. But that, in a nutshell, is the work we're doing. Now, it's all right for me to sit here and say to everyone that's listening, or to anyone who cares to listen in my groups or anything, oh, look, the job's pretty easy. Just change yourself from a mortal being to an immortal being. Well, everyone would just look at me as though I'm a crazy man. It takes years and years. It actually takes lifetimes to make that change. And I'd put to the listeners, Jacqui, and to yourself, that probably everyone that's listening has already had some previous lifetimes, and there will be discussion in the chapters on reincarnations and what's called wheels of birth and death, which we'll get to, so I won't elaborate here. But we've already had a number of lifetimes to be even tuning into these podcasts. It means the person has actually woken up and is now in this lifetime wanting to continue on their spiritual journey, their spiritual development. So that's what we'll be trying to achieve in these, not trying to, I'm sure we will achieve some success for everyone to have a greater understanding of the two selves.
I think so too. Just one quick reflection, and then I'm going to hand over to you to keep launching along. But for anyone who's curious and listening into these podcasts and you are more at the beginner stage of the journey, one way I often like to speak to this in beginner yoga classes is just that awareness on knowing ourselves in the world. Here we are as a body, we've got the mind, the emotions, we engage in the world and we interact. But sometimes how we present forward in life and we engage with others is not always how we truly, really feel deep within. So think even at those moments in life where, someone asks how we are and we put on the facade and we say, I'm fine, I'm totally great, yes, I'd like to do that, or whatever it might be. But deep down inside, there's actually a knowing that you don't feel okay in that moment, that actually your preference would be to do something else. So that just gives a very brief example that sometimes how we're presenting what we're doing, what we're saying, how we're behaving is actually very different if we really attune to that quiet inner voice of truth within. It's different. So that can be just something perhaps that might be easy to grasp onto if you're at the beginner stage of the journey, just this awareness that there's something else within inside us. And as Michael's indicated, this whole text and these whole conversations are really based around how we start to know that part of ourselves more, how we can tune into the wisdom that's there and the useful parts to help move us forward in life in the most optimal, progressive fashion in order that we evolve as we were meant to. So anyway, enough from me. Over to you, Michael, with what you're planning to share next.
Okay, Jacqui, thanks. I think we've got off to a lovely start on this podcast. I'm very happy. So before I actually start on chapter 1, I'd just like to go back to the background that I shared with you last week on the whole teachings of the Bhagavad Gita. And just a lovely quote from Swami Maharaj, who extols the greatness of the Gita, and he writes it this way. He says, the Gita expounds very lucidly the fundamentals of yoga philosophy. It's a great source of wisdom. It's a great guide a supreme teacher, an inexhaustible spiritual treasure. It's a function of bliss, an ocean of knowledge. It's full of divine splendor and grandeur. So this is a wonderful thought, that this is what we'll be tapping into in these remaining podcasts. And before I actually start now on chapter 1, I'd just like to very briefly introduce the two main players in this dialogue that'll play out throughout the 18 chapters. Briefly, there's Krishna. He's a physical embodiment of Lord Brahman. So in other words, a human embodiment of the consciousness itself. And he's Arjuna's friend, and he eventually becomes his teacher or his guru. And Arjuna is the other major player. He's Krishna's friend and eventually becomes his devoted disciple. He's experiencing difficulties in his life and he realizes he needs help. He represents any of the 8 billion people on this planet. He represents all of you, the listeners. He represents you, Jacqui. He represents me, all 8 billion people. And everyone else who will eventually wake up and want to pursue their desire for true happiness, which eventually leads, as I said earlier on, to self-realization or enlightenment. So the Gita is best understood by those who can identify with Arjuna and accept Krishna as the supreme divinity for the teaching to result in maximum understanding. So in this sense, I'd urge you all to try and keep remembering throughout the podcast that every time Arjuna's name is mentioned, it's referring to you specifically, the listener. And because I'm the smart man, I'm going to be Krishna and I'll be your teacher.
That's actually a good point. Sorry, I promise not to interrupt, but you've mentioned guru a few times, and most listeners will understand and have context for that, but some may not. So important to clarify. Guru simply means teacher, or one that takes people from darkness to light, from ignorance to understanding. So just to give that a little bit more context, but yes, you are the teacher. Continue.
Yeah, lovely. That's exactly what it is. It's broken up into 2 words, gu and ru. One's a dispeller of, and one's the darkness, so dispeller of darkness. So it's a person, basically. So I don't, pretend to sort of take on any roles, but just from this perspective, that's how it's going to work out in these podcasts. On that aspect of being involved in it, because if you don't involve yourself in it personally, and say I'm Arjuna and Michael and Jacqui are sort of my teachers in this regard, it'll be like you're watching a film or reading a book, you're not involved. You're sort of observing two other people. But by identifying with one or the other, you have what's called skin in the game. You've got a vested interest in it. So that's the idea of that. And there's a little story I'll just quickly share with you that illustrates this very nicely. It describes a disciple living with his guru in an ashram, in ancient India. And he's, a little bit proudly says to his guru, "Oh, I've gone through the Gita 7 times, Guru, 7 times." And the Guru just looks at him very quietly and says to him, "Yes, but has the Gita gone through you?" So can you see the difference between, that's the emphasis on an intellectual understanding of any great work as against a deep inner knowing, a resonance that resonates when the person reading it or listening resonates with what's being said, and it becomes a true knowledge as against a limited mind knowledge. It's a subtle distinction, but it's a very important one, and one that we need to really keep in mind over these coming podcasts.
It's very powerful. Even as you said that, I could feel the impact of that go into my body, because I'm sure we've all met in our circles in life, and people listening too. We meet people that intellectually know a lot. They've read a lot of books, they can quote a lot of things. I don't know about you. When I observe a lot of people, I think there's sometimes a gap. And actually, the more loudly they speak and the more loudly they want to let you know how much they know and what they've read, sometimes the less that looks like it's translated into their everyday living. So that's in essence what we're really talking about here. It's not just intellectually understanding, although that is a very important part of this process. It's how you transmute that and you learn to live your life from a better place. That's actually really what these conversations are all about.
Yeah, well, again, a brilliant observation, Jacqui, and the fact that you just mentioned that gave me goosebumps or something like that. These are the comments I hear over 30 years and apply to me when I read something. Like I've read books where I haven't known the author or anything about him, and tears just start rolling down my cheeks. There's a sort of a connection, and there's a beauty in it, but that transcends the ordinary emotions and the ordinary mind. This is going sort of into that higher realm that we were discussing earlier on.
Yes.
So, on that line, I could just say to people, well, don't take too much notice of my appearance. I'm an 80-year-old man. I might say things a bit clumsily or something like that. But don't be too worried about that. The important thing that I'd be stressing to you is, as I'm speaking in all of these podcasts, listen with an open heart, like Jacqui's just saying, and see if there's a resonance. If you're feeling already that there's a resonance between yourself and myself, well, that's fantastic. If you're not, well, just be a little bit patient and maybe that'll start to develop over the coming podcasts. And possibly if it doesn't, well, I'd imagine some people will drop off, because if that resonance isn't there, it doesn't keep the partnership, if you like, or whatever going. So that was a lovely observation, Jacqui, and I'm sure all of our listeners will be able to understand all that. I'm very confident of that.
Yes.
All right.
Now I'm handing back to you, and I'm just going to flag for both of us the time, because I feel like we're chatting, and even though it's beautiful chatting and it feels incredibly relevant and useful to do, time is still moving on. So I'm just going to let you pick up with what you feel is the most important next stage of this conversation.
Yeah. Well, time is. I've just had a glance down. It's amazing, isn't it, how fast, how quickly a 40-minute podcast or any session takes place.
Yes.
Well, begin now with chapter 1 and starting off just simply with the title of the chapter. Chapter 1 in my Gita that I'm referring to is called The Yoga of Arjuna's Despondency. Now, notice the word Arjuna's Despondency. Other Gitas, and I've mentioned I've got a number, but I'll just quickly run through some chapter headings, how other commentators put it. One calls it the Yoga of Despair. Another one says Arjuna's anguish, Arjuna's grief. So you can see despondency, despair, anguish, grief. The reason for that is that I'm sure all the listeners, Jacqui, can relate to some despondency or grief or anguish in our lives. Okay? That's why this chapter is so important, because it's setting the scene of where we are and then taking us to a higher level over the following chapters. So you mentioned a word there with guru, and it needs to be understood and explained. I'd just like to touch on a similar vein here. So it says the yoga of Arjuna's despondency. Now, yoga in Sanskrit, a lot of the words in Sanskrit language can have different meanings. In its purest meaning, the word yoga means union and refers to union with you and with God. That's the ultimate self-realization. But yoga can also mean path, the path to that union. And so we have examples like Ajnana yoga, the path of knowledge to God. Then there's karma yoga, the path of action to God. Then there's bhakti yoga, the path of devotion to God. And many of the people who are yoga practitioners, their yoga is referred to as hatha yoga. But in one sense or another, they're all paths to God, which is the ultimate yoga of union with God. So yoga is going to be mentioned a fair few times throughout the Gita, and one needs to be aware that there is this difference, or, there's the same, but there is a subtle difference between it. And that's for some general background to chapter 1. So all stories have a beginning which sets the scene and introduces the main characters. The Gita is no different, although it's somewhat unusual, in that it has two themes running simultaneously. The first theme is quite straightforward in that it describes a physical battle scene. This chapter focuses on this. The second theme is much more complex, as it describes the same battle scene in a very subtle way, in that it focuses heavily on the individual human being, which is us. So in simple terms, there's a physical battle called Kurukshetra in a place in India 5,000 years ago between two armies, and they're fighting over a kingdom. And there's a subtle battle taking place within each individual. Every individual on the planet, whether they understand any of this or not. And there's two major players in there, the two armies, and they're in the context of this teaching. One army is called the egoic army, and the other army is called the buddhi army. And that's your higher self army or your lower self army, or your mortal army or your immortal army. And these two are in constant battle. But because we don't know very much about the higher army, we're basically only fighting with the mortal army. And that's not going to give any person, no matter how they're managing their lives, the ultimate happiness that they're seeking. All right?
I think it's an important point too. Just quickly, I'll share that one of the copies of the Bhagavad Gita, which I started to read, which is this one by Paramahansa Yogananda, a beautiful text, but incredibly heavy going. And as I read for the very first time, quite some time back, the first chapter, there's so many names and so many players in the army. I think it's not uncommon for Westerners to read that and just be a little overwhelmed at the outset. Like, do I need to remember all these players and what they all do and the symbolism of them? But as you're just saying, if we can just keep in mind as we travel through reading that, if some of you are reading a text alongside, regardless of whose commentary it is, that we remember the symbolism of it, that seems to be a key takeaway that we could keep in mind.
Yes, yeah. And, like you say, Paramahansa Yogananda's Gita, to my experience and understanding, would be the most detailed and the most precise Gita that any person could read. He leaves no stone unturned, dots every I and crosses every T. So every amount of knowledge he puts into it was a brilliant being, a fully realised being, no shadow of a doubt in my mind. But very difficult for beginners, to take that on. Now, Jacqui, I gave you a couple of sheets with a handout when we were discussing that we'd be running these sessions, if you recall.
I do, and I don't have them here, but I'm hoping you'll be able to explain them or summarise them for everybody.
Yeah, well, this was, following on what you're just saying, how difficult chapter 1 is. And I've known people who have started to read chapter 1 and thrown it away almost in disgust and said to me, oh, it's talking about killing your family and your uncles and aunties and your teachers and all sorts of stuff. I'm not going to read rubbish like that. Well, you know, when there's not enough knowledge, you could interpret it that way. But you're just totally not understanding and missing the point, which will become clear as the teaching goes on. What we're killing off is not a physical being. There's no one's ever going to have blood on their hands. You don't need knives or guns or anything like this in this teaching. The killing off is friends that we relish within us, in our mind and in our emotions, our beliefs and opinions and our likes and dislikes and our expectations. They're the things that we're talking about killing off. Most of those are our enemy. They're doing us a lot of harm that we don't recognize, causing us tension and anger and stress and loss of sleep and a mind that feels sometimes like it's going to explode. All of these things, that's all the enemy within that we're talking about having to eliminate or kill off. You know, in the nicer words, we call them letting them go, not be attached to them anymore. But those words need to be understood. The full implication of it needs to be understood. So maybe because we are running short of time, if I could just briefly read through these two pages, but they're bullet points, and yes. I think we'll give the listeners enough, you know, a broad picture of this real subtle, heavy type of material that's in chapter 1. So firstly, it starts off with the setting. And as I say, all of these points I'll be making, I'll be referring to an actual thing that's happening and a subtle aspect to it. So bear with me. So the setting of this battle takes place on an actual battlefield in ancient India, and it's a place called Kurukshetra. Now, you don't have to remember, but that's it. It's like in Melbourne or in Sydney or in New York, a battle taking place, but it's really so the symbolic is that it's a place called in our bodies, the battle in there. So one battle's on the actual battlefield with armies and another one's in here, inside. The theme is that about who's the rightful ruler. The two parties in India were two lots of brothers and their sons then fighting over a kingdom. And one, like a coup, one wants to take over the rightful rulers, which was Arjuna's side, but he lost his kingdom because he foolishly went into a game of dice. He gambled and lost. But the agreement was that when, after 13 years in exile, they'd come back and they'd reclaim the kingdom and the cousins would let them have it. But when they came back, the cousins said, "Nick off, we're not, you can't have your kingdom. We've changed our minds." And so so it goes on to say the characters in this, and I've already referred to them, are Krishna, and symbolic represents Krishna represents the physical embodiment of God, and Arjuna represents us, the mortal being, wanting to connect with God and learn through his teachings, through Krishna's teachings. So actually there's an army called the Pandava army, 5 brothers, and they're led by Arjuna. He's the main player in the story. There's the Kaurava army, and that's the baddies, if you like. There's the goodies and the baddies. Any film or any story is always boils down to that. Because he's a blind king, but that represents he's ignorant. So he's representing the egoic side of it. And so he has 100 sons, because in your blindness, you need all the help you can get through your ignorance to get you through life. And the main player there is his son, Duryodhana. And again, you don't have to remember that any more than just in this context, that's the 2 opponents. And they're the leaders of the 2 armies. The armies and the generals that are described in the qualities of the human, of the 2 different aspects, qualities of the human being, of any human being. So I'll just finish off on that Pandava and Kaurava army. So the actual army, the symbolic of the Pandava army, led by Arjuna, is our Buddhi, King Buddhi, our divine aspect, which is the real part of our being. On the Kaurava army, it's called King Ego. So we've got 2 rulers, King Buddhi and King Ego in our beings. It's the mortal aspect, which is unreal. So that's the battle between the human being, every human being. So everyone out there listening, you've got a battle taking place inside you that you might not be aware of as clearly as I'm describing now, but it'll become more clear in the next podcast when we'll elaborate on it a bit more and throughout the teaching itself. And then so the generals, Arjuna and Duryodhana, they represent the qualities that are within us. So the actual people in Arjuna's army, there's a whole list of them in the Gita that Jacqui mentioned in all the Gitas. They do your head in because they're long Indian names. You can't pronounce them, all that sort of stuff. But anyway, I'll have a quick go at some of them. So the goodies, just in case you do read it or have a flick through, Arjuna, Bhima, Vairati, Yudhishthira, Drupada, etc. And on the other side, there's Duryodhana, Drona, Kripa, Bhishma, Karma, etc. And symbolically, the qualities of Arjuna, and that's our higher self, things like divine calmness, self-control over body, mind, and senses, restraint over negative aspects of our being, divine devotion, discriminative intelligence, courage, strength, discipline, all that you're going to draw on to continue this journey. Heaps amount of courage and discipline are going to be required by individuals. And on the other side, on the ego side, you got material desires. We're all chasing this and we're chasing that, and we're avoiding this and we're avoiding that. There's habitual tendencies. How hard is it to change our tendencies? You'll all find out how hard it is when we read these 18 chapters, because we're going to have to change almost everything within our being. You'll probably find that almost impossible to understand or accept. But trust, and you will do it, and you can do it, and you must do it if you want to make changes in your life. If it's the same, if you keep doing what you've always done, you'll always get what you always got. Now, if you're happy with your lives and you don't need any changes, well, these talks aren't of much value to you. But if you feel that you'd like some extra happiness, or even a lot of extra happiness, well, you'll need to make changes, because what you're doing isn't going to make any difference. That'll be clear, I think. And then just to finish off, so we got a choice. So Arjuna eventually gets his chariot in between the two armies, and he looks at who's on his side and who he's fighting, these qualities that I'm talking about. And he's got a choice then as to which army. And he comes to a point where he says, I can't fight my enemy, so I give up. So he's going to stay with his habitual tendencies that I've just outlined. Yeah, but we'll see in the next little bit of the work that he comes to his senses somehow, and he gets to a stage where we all are now, where we're realizing we would like to make some changes, and we are prepared to make an effort and fight to make those changes. So he goes, so the choice is, or Krishna comes in here, and Krishna, being the universal embodiment of truth, is available to all human beings on the planet, whether they're operating from your lower mortal self or whether we're trying to operate from our higher self. He doesn't sort of go away just because you're doing something bad or evil or whatever. He just says, so he offers the two leaders an option. He says, one of you can have all my army, all the extra charioteers and bowmen and all of that, and the other one can have me. And Duryodhana, because he's mortal and materialistic minded, he thinks like the equivalent today, more tanks, more aircraft carriers, more bombs. That's what I want. Whereas Arjuna's realizing, no, I don't need more of that sort of stuff. I need more finer knowledge, more divine understanding. So he chooses Krishna, and his cousin, chooses the extra army and extra soldiers. Well, we know that truth, power versus force, one of David Hawkins' books, Power versus Force, he's talking about power, the power that comes from divine truth as against force of anyone forcing stuff onto you, even at the point of a gun, can't change what you feel or what you're experiencing in a divine aspect. So they're the two. So Arjuna, as I say, and that's going to be us. We're going to choose Buddhi, our higher self, and Duryodhana, our old self, mortal self, he's going to stick with all the material things, but gradually we're going to overpower him. Is that a good point to finish off on, Jacqui?
That's a very good point. I feel like it would be so easy to keep talking because it's just getting exciting. I'm even on the edge of my seat thinking what happens next, because I'm just keeping up with the chapters in the background as we do these podcasts. But yes, with time and the state that it is, it's a good point to pause. And I think just picking up on one of the points you were making there, Michael, about whether we seek happiness or seek change, that there are, of course, times in life where we feel that we're incredibly challenged to the absolute core of our being. And I'm guessing that many of you listening will have known that in your own life. But for some of you, and particularly if you're a little younger in life, maybe some true hardship hasn't hit yet. But I think it's important to remind ourselves that if life does feel okay, sometimes people are just searching for a little more happiness and a little more contentment. But if we've really felt at a crossroads, and if we've known true pain and grief and loss, then we do have more skin in the game, so to speak. We're extra keen to learn new skills and new insights to bring out the resilience and our capacity and really expand into the truth and fullness that we are here to be. So I'm excited for what we're going to talk about as we cover all of these sessions. Now, so thank you for today. We did talk, Michael and I did talk in the background about at the end of each week, we're going to try and leave with a little exercise or a little thought, something that all of us, can focus on for the week ahead, so that if we are watching or listening to these podcasts a week at a time, that we've got something that we can practice on. Because again, it's all very well and good learning things intellectually and theoretically, but it's how we integrate that information, how we practice it in daily life with our family, our friends, our workplaces. So Michael, what do you have for us? What can we focus on for the week ahead?
Well, it's going to be a very simple focus. I don't think anyone will have any trouble with this one. But amazing, isn't it? Or I'm constantly amazed with all this. But what you've just said in those last few minutes, it leads into exactly the exercise that I've got planned, to mention. But before I do that, just quickly, so that you're saying how enthused you are, and you would love to sort of follow on in that. Well, just so everyone's not left in any abeyance, next week's session, we will focus entirely on that battle. We've set the scene, if you like. We're going to focus on that battlefield. So we're going to look at why it was set on the battle, the whole teaching set on the battle, which is an unusual thing, and we're going to explore it personally as to about the battles taking place, so people can relate with it. And you made the point of some people, particularly younger ones, traveling happily, and there's no problem, and it could be older ones as well. But what I can say just quickly on that is that it doesn't matter how perfect your life is, in inverted commas, has been or is now. You've got all the money you want, all family satisfaction, career satisfaction, all of these sorts of things. There will still be one thing that'll lead you to searching for the truth, and that'll be that because you don't know your higher self, there'll be a feeling of emptiness in an individual, and that will be what will force them to turn towards what's called the truth. All right. So on that note, I'll just, the exercise that I've set for you this week is simply to reflect, and I've put in brackets, don't dwell, please don't dwell, but just reflect over any moment you get during the course of the week. Have you in the past or currently in your present moment or stage in life experienced situations in your life where you've experienced some turmoil within, some stress within, some anxiety within, some suffering, mental and emotional? You're crying, you're upset, someone's hurt you, whatever it might be. So just simply observe, or I'm sure as I'm speaking, stuff's flooding in. You'd be a rare individual if you couldn't say that, if you'd be saying, no, none of this has happened to me. So as I say, I don't want you to dwell on it. I don't want you to rake up over hot coals or something. We're all doing that anyway when instances arise. But this is what what I was talking about, the fundamental changes we're going to make, so we can clear all that sort of rubbish out of our lives. And ask yourself also, when you're reflecting on these times, how did you feel at that moment or in those situations? And invariably, you wouldn't be saying you felt too happy. So if we can just get that sorted out so that you're all in yourself knowing, well, this sort of is really applied to me somewhere along the way in my life, and it's something I'd try to avoid if I could to have happen to me in the future remaining years of my life. So that's the purpose of that exercise. All right, Jacqui?
Great. And that can be a good one, I think, not just to reflect in the past, but literally for all of us. I'll practice this too as we go through the week, watching as we live life and engage with people as something happens and we notice that we move from the state we're in to being influenced by something else. Like catching it in the moment is probably a really good thing for all of us to play with. But yeah, that's an excellent focus. All right. Well, thank you so much, Michael. And thank you to everyone listening. And we will see you next week. Was there any closing words you wanted to part with, Michael, or we're done for today?
Just simply to say it's been, for me, a delightful session, Jacqui. I've loved your enthusiasm, and I'm sure other people that are listening have. Could I just say to everyone, thank you for tuning in, giving me your time, and I trust that the words I've shared with you today will have some importance for you. So over and out, everyone.
Beautiful. Thank you.